Hi everyone, I'm Laura. In this session we're going to be speaking with elite ultra runner Dylan Bowman. Dylan, in his own words, is a perpetuator of stoke and appreciator of endurance. A former lacrosse player, he now plays mostly in the mountains. He's had a highly successful ultra running career already, racing in some of the world's biggest races, and notably has the fastest known time for traversing California's Lost Coast. The last year or so have been challenging for Dylan through injury. However, he's back and raring to go in 2020. He runs for the North Face and Red Bull. Born in Reno, Nevada, grew up in Boulder, Colorado. Dylan is 33 years old and now lives in Portland, Oregon. Dylan, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate you having me.
Oh, it's lovely. Pleasure. So before we sort of jump into the detail, I start to ask you about your training and all that sort of nitty gritty. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your background and how your running journey started.
Sure. So I have a somewhat unique history with the sport of running in that I found it fairly late in life, at least, to now have it be sort of like my professional career. I was a team sport athlete growing up. As you mentioned in your introduction, I played lacrosse through high school and college. And then it was only after I graduated from college and finished my lacrosse career that I sort of found running as my passion in life. I've always been a sporty person, always been somebody who loves to train and compete. And so after I had finished playing lacrosse, it was the first time in my life where I didn't have sort of that structured schedule anymore of being an athlete. And so I just started running. And again, as I think is the case for a lot of people, you start learning about races, you sign up for races, you see yourself improve, and it just becomes this building momentum. And before you know it, you've become totally indoctrinated into the sport and obsessed with it. And that's sort of how it happened for me. And I've been lucky to now have about a 10-year career as a runner, and a lot of successes, some failures, and yeah, just overall, I love it. Love the sport. And, I'm hoping I still have many more years in front of me.
Oh wow! And just trying to understand what were your motivations for becoming an ultra running? For taking on these great long distances as opposed to something shorter. And
yeah, well, I think I've always been a person of extremes, and it just happened to be that at the time when I started running after college, as I had mentioned, I was living in Aspen, Colorado, which of course is right in the heart of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado at 8,000 feet. And so I was in the environment where if you're going to go running, you might as well just go run in the mountains. And then because I started doing that more often, I sort of became, a little more involved in the culture and learning more about trail running. And then, as soon as you learn about these longer races and ultra running, at least for me, that's what captured my imagination and really sort of like motivated me. And it was the Leadville 100 that I learned about that time, 2008 or 2009. And that became sort of like my life's mission to do, which I did for the first time in 2010 when I was like, I think 24 years old. So that's sort of how it progressed for me and where the motivation came from.
Wow. And quite young really then, 24, to do the Leadville.
Right. Yeah. And, I said that I had sort of come to running late in life. And by that, I mean that I was never a runner growing up. I never ran track or cross country. As I said, I was a team sport athlete. So it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I even, ran for exercise. That being said, when I started running, I went straight to ultra running. So I bypassed a lot of the development that a lot of people use by doing 5Ks and 10Ks and marathons. And I sort of went straight for the long distance stuff. So I was very young at the time. And even it was even more unusual in that era of the sport, the 2009, 2010 era. Whereas now there are more younger athletes coming into the sport sort of straight out of college, or even earlier sometimes. And but for me, or at least at that time, I was sort of unusual, or at least on the very younger edge of like the competitive field. So luckily, now I'm 33, and I think, the fact that I didn't run a lot as a kid has allowed me to remain somewhat healthy. As you mentioned, I've had some struggles this year, but yeah, I was late to running in general, but very early to ultra running.
Yeah, great. So, obviously we said about that you've had a challenging year. Has this been the biggest challenge that you've had for your journey this last year? Has that been the sort of hardest time that you've had?
Yeah, easily. And that's not to say that, life has always been easy, but for me, like I've been really lucky in that my health has always been something that has been good, has always been something that I can rely on. I seem to be pretty durable. I'm not injury prone, but this year I've just had like a string of bad luck basically. And maybe it's the good karma that I had accumulated for 33 years coming back to bite me in one single season. But yeah, it's easily been my hardest year. Even going back to when I was a kid, I never really got hurt when I was playing lacrosse. And so it's been difficult to deal with, but also it's been a valuable year for me, just kind of understanding that, your health is precious and that you have to take advantage of it, and you have to really, just, yeah, sort of, I mean, it sounds cliche, but just sort of like treat your career that like it is finite, like there is no tomorrow, and really cherish your health when you have it. So yeah, it's been a difficult year, but I've learned a lot from it. And, I feel like my body's bouncing back now, and hopefully the worst is behind me.
Oh, good. So, but yeah, interesting to see that it's changed your mindset, focused your mind a little bit, and yeah, made you appreciate things.
Absolutely.
So over the course of your, your career, you've said you've had, several years now where you've been competing at this high level. Over the course of your career, what have been the most common or the biggest mistakes that you've made?
Honestly, I think what's more notable is the fact that I feel like I've made very few mistakes in my career. And I think I've been very lucky, for one thing, as I mentioned, just seeming to have like a body that's held up to the enormous challenges and stresses of our sport. But I think I've always been good at managing my workload. So, I've never been somebody who is prone to overtraining, not somebody who races too much. I'm basically, for my whole career, I've raced, between like 4 or 6 times a year. So it's not as if I'm racing every month, as some people might be tempted to do. And so I've managed my my health and my energy level, I think, really well over the course of my career. That's not to say that I haven't made any mistakes, right? Like there's always things that can be improved. And, for me, I think the most important thing that it's not necessarily a mistake, but the most important thing that I've implemented recently, or that I've taken more seriously recently, is the importance of strength training, physical therapy, correcting imbalances, and, thus preserving and extending your sort of physical health and your longevity in the sport. Because, when I came into the sport at a young age, I sort of had this natural sort of athleticism from playing sports my whole life. I was able to improve quickly, and I was young. So I just was able to handle the stress, and handle the abuse. And now I'm 33, and, things change as you get older. And, it now takes me, these are things that I have to pay attention to more now. And I clearly see the advantage in my health and in how I feel in my performance when I do focus on the strength training component. So I would say, one of the bigger mistakes that sort of led, I think, to this season of disappointment and bad health was that I had been neglecting some of that small stuff, and sort of left myself vulnerable to injury. Now that I'm in my 30s, you sort of have to take that stuff more seriously.
Yeah, I certainly don't think it's uncommon, like you said, when you're young and your body is just seems to handle everything you throw at it, and then yeah. Um, what about influences on you? Are there any particular people or books or anything in particular that's had an impact on you and your running?
Well, yeah, there's tons. I mean, I'm somebody who is a big fan of the sport in addition to, obviously competing myself. And I came up in a sort of interesting era of the sport when it was kind of in its infancy, at least like on the professional end of it. And so when I was coming up, it was sort of the era of like Anton Krupicka and Jeff Rose, Hal Kerner and Carl Meltzer and Scott Jurek and all these guys. And they all had a tremendous influence on me, just in providing motivation. I would read their blogs and sort of try and pick up little pieces of information as it regards to training and race strategy and nutrition. So those guys all were huge influences on me, along with many other, sort of similar kind of like famous ultra runners, Ellie Greenwood and Nikki Kimball and, some of the greats that we've seen in the last, 10 or 15 years, at least when I've been in the sport. My coach has also been an immense influence on me, and it's somebody whose opinion and relationship I really cherish. His name's Jason Koop. He probably won't need much introduction with the audience, but he's an amazing American ultra coach. He's written a great book on the subject called, I think, like Training Tips for Ultra Runners or something like that. I should know that off the top of my head, but he is also an incredible influence on me. His book, I've read it twice, even though I have, daily access to talk to him. I still find it to be a great resource. And then, yeah, just like outside of ultra specifically, one of the things that has really helped me this year with regards to injury and, how to make those difficult circumstances more valuable is another really great book called Reboot. And this is a book that's kind of specific to, it's supposed to be like a business book, but I think it's very good for athletes too, particularly athletes who are going through difficult situations. I was actually just on the Reboot podcast with the author, sort of talking about a lot of the themes. So we don't need to go into too much detail. If the listeners want to listen to that, they can. But that also had a really big influence on me this year, a big impact, and was really helpful during a tough time.
Yeah. It's interesting how something that, like you say, not necessarily related to running, but there's a book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, which is, again, it's not anything to do with running, but it's
right.
Had similarly, I read it and like so much of it you could relate to.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite race distance?
I mean, I would say that the 100-mile distance is my favorite, just because those are always the races that I target, the most, or, when I'm thinking about my calendar, those are always the biggest priority races for me. I think I'm probably better at like the 100K to 120K distance. But the 100-mile distance is sort of what captured my imagination when I was in my early 20s, as I mentioned earlier, and what still motivates me more than anything else. So I'd say that's my favorite.
Yeah. And what are you focusing on in 2020?
Well, I was lucky enough to be selected in the Hard Rock 100 lottery at the end of last year. And of course, Hard Rock was canceled this year due to heavy snowpack in Colorado, which deferred my entry to next year into 2020. And it was a blessing for me because of the injuries that I had this year that the race was actually postponed. So that will be my target objective for 2020.
Wow. And, what about long term, sort of thinking about your career? Have you got any sort of overarching, goals or aspirations?
Yeah, I would say my biggest goal, and particularly having gone through injury now for the last year, is to just be in the sport, training and competing for as long as I can. I just really love everything that it's given me, and all the friendships and experiences and just like these powerful sort of life-changing moments that you get, these feelings of achievement. It's just something that I love and that I've missed, you know, in times of injury. And so for me, you know, there's still a lot of races that I want to do around the world, Hard Rock being near the top of that list. There's a lot of races that I've done in the past that I'd love to go back to and do again, such as the UTMB. And, you know, in order to do all those things, you know, my health is the most important thing. And so just doing all those little things and maintaining like a healthy relationship with myself and not putting too much emphasis on my performance, but more so doing it for the love of it. Those are my biggest takeaways from this year, and things that I'm hoping to now sort of keep at the forefront of my career in the years to come.
Yeah.
So still a lot of goals to achieve.
Yeah, it's that's lovely though, that you having that year away from it has made you realize what you really missed about it. And like you said, it's something else, isn't it? The community. I mean, I think the running community in general, but particularly that little pocket that is the ultra running community.
It's really, really something special. And I think everybody who's been, you know, exposed to it sort of comes away with similar feelings. And again, for me, like, it's changed my life in so many great ways. And, you know, I just want to be part of it for as long as I can, both, you know, just on a competitive level personally, like I want my competitive career to be as long as I can, but then also just preserve my health so that, you know, I can still go and run 100-mile races even well after I have competitive ambitions to just go enjoy time in the mountains and push myself. So those are sort of the forefront of my priorities here in the years to come.
Yeah, I think they're amazing goals. Okay, so if we sort of talk a little bit more now about the sort of technical side of your training and that sort of thing. So let's say, for example, we were 3 or 4 weeks out from a key 50-mile race. How would your sort of training look like at that, you know, sort of in your peak week before you went into taper? How would your training sort of look at that time?
Sure. So, and again, I'm going to sort of lean on everything that I've learned from my coach, Jason Coop here. And he designs and prescribes all my training, though we have a really great sort of back and forth relationship where I can provide my input as well. His philosophy is to simulate the race as best as possible in every way, right? So whether it's the terrain that you're going to be racing in, the environment you're going to be racing in, and especially the intensity at which you anticipate racing. So, you know, for example, like before, say, UTMB, in order to achieve those things, I went out to Colorado to train. So, you know, I spent 6 or 8 weeks in the mountains training, you know, in a similar environment, similar altitude, similar terrain to what you would anticipate confronting in the Alps. So that was first and foremost. And then when it comes to the specific training, for example, you know, Monday is always kind of like my rest day. So Monday, I almost always take completely off. Sometimes I'll ride on a stationary bike for an hour just to get the blood moving a little bit. But for the most part, that's my rest day. And then I'll usually do 2 workouts a week. And again, it's important based on our philosophy of training that you simulate the race intensity as best as you can during those workouts. So for something like UTMB, of course, you're not trying to develop your VO2 max at that part of the year. So I'm not doing like, you know, full gas type intervals. I'm doing more sort of like 75% type interval work, what we call steady state. And that's sort of a good simulator of a race intensity of 100 miles for something like UTMB. So specificity is key. And I guess, you know, to put metrics on it, if people are interested, I would say at most I'll do between maybe 20 hours training a week, usually, you know, closer to 15, with probably anywhere between like 20 and 30,000 feet of elevation gain. And then I also will do, so in terms of mileage, that probably comes out to between 90 and 110 miles a week most of the time when I'm really training hard. So not an immense amount of volume, but certainly enough to make you feel like you're training. And then I usually will ride on a stationary bike a couple of times a week. I find it's a really nice sort of supplemental stimulus, low intensity. I'll do that usually 2 or 3 times a week for an hour each time. So I usually do that, you know, on my recovery day on Monday, usually on Friday as well. And then either like, you know, Tuesday or Wednesday, usually in the week. So that paints a broad picture. So, you know, when you're training for a 100-miler, obviously volume is key. Still do a couple of workouts a week. And then, and those are focused on, you know, the intensity at which I anticipate racing. And then Sunday is almost always a long run. So if I'm getting ready for a 100-mile race, it's anywhere between like 5 and 8 or 9 hours sometimes. So yeah, that gives you a general idea of what the training looks like.
That's interesting. So what you're saying about your sessions, that you're obviously it's not conducive to what you're training for, to be doing hard intervals and things like that. And you mentioned steady state running. So kind of when you're explaining that to the audience, you'd sort of would I be right in saying it's sort of that sort of comfortably uncomfortable? So it's that sort of level of effort where it's uncomfortable but it's sustainable, you know, and sort of how long would you aim to keep that, be in that sort of zone for?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, we call it steady state. It's sort of like 1 or 2 notches up from like your just default long run pace. So, and I think it's important to mention that we do all of our training based on perceived exertion rather than heart rate or pace. We think that's just a much better indication of, you know, like the appropriate training stress is how you know, subjectively feel about the intensity. But for a steady state workout, again, I'm aiming for like a 7 or an 8 out of 10, basically, on the perceived effort scale. And for an example workout that I would do is something like 2 by 30 minutes. So 2 30-minute pushes. And again, it's not like all out pushes. It's sort of like, you know, 1 or 2 notches up from sort of default pace. And so do a 30-minute push, and then usually a really short recovery of only maybe like 5 minutes, and then another 30-minute push. So you sort of have a short recovery, you accumulate about an hour of intensity, and usually that would be over the course of a 2.5 or a 3-hour run. So, you know, obviously you have a lot of sort of endurance pace effort during that session as well, just sort of like default long run pace, with just a little bit more up tempo stuff, again, to just be as specific as possible to the intensity that I anticipate racing at.
Yeah.
So really to sort of balance it out. So if I was doing a 50-mile race, my intervals would be shorter, but a little bit more intense. So for example, before the North Face 50-miler, which I did just a couple of weeks ago, I was doing a lot of like 4 by 10 minute type efforts. So instead of 30 minutes, it's 10 minutes. And there's a little bit more recovery, but you're going harder. And that is, again, to better simulate the intensity of a 50-mile race.
Yeah, I see. So it's trying to get the balance between the elements of endurance and stamina, depending on what you're going to meet in the race, I suppose.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier about appreciating the need to incorporate strength training in your training now. So can you just talk us through a little bit about what you do, with regards to your strength training?
Yeah. So for me, at this point, you know, it's all about longevity and making sure that past injuries are well supported with physical strength around them. So my Achilles heel, pardon the pun, is my ankles. I've had traumatic injuries to both of my ankles, and they've always sort of been my vulnerability. And so a lot of the strength work that I do is to ensure that I have stability in my feet now, to try and, maintain and improve the health of my ankles. So a lot of single leg balancing work, sort of standing on unstable surfaces like a Bosu ball or like an inflatable disc, doing squats at the same time, often with like kettlebells or weights, just to make it a little bit harder. Some kind of marching drills with weight over my head, even deadlifts, things like that. And then, typical core work as well, I think is really important to maintain your physical posture and your stability, vertically while you're on the trail. And what I've learned is that I had a very intense sort of stride analysis done recently, where it sort of showed that I move quite a lot laterally as I'm running, which of course then when I'm landing on an unstable foot and I'm moving in a direction, I'm sort of increasing my instability just by lacking some of that core strength down the center. And then of course, like glutes and hips, everybody knows those are notoriously weak in a lot of runners. And they also contribute, I think, to problems further down the chain. So I found recently that I have significant weakness in my glutes and hips, which can contribute to, ankle instability as well. So ankle instability is like the core thing that I'm focused on in my strength training, but it's really a whole body sort of reprogramming to ensure that there's not imbalances, and that movement isn't like, I have range of motion and I have appropriate strength, and I'm not compensating for certain weaknesses with stronger muscles and things like that, which compound over time. And again, now that I'm in my 30s, you just have to pay more attention to that stuff, and things like that show up more clearly as you become older. So that's just a few examples of what I've been doing.
Yeah, that's interesting, because like you said, the symptom is the instability of the ankles, but actually you found that you can't just treat that symptom. You've got to kind of find the cause. And with a lot of runners, you're right, the posterior chain, so the back, the glutes, that's often kind of what's weaker. And yeah, so it's interesting to hear that. And actually my next question was going to be, how do you kind of ensure that you're running with good form? And you mentioned that you'd had some analysis done that had sort of looked at your form, so that's quite interesting. When you're racing and you're getting tired and exhausted, how do you kind of check yourself to make sure that your form is good?
Well, I guess I've always just taken it for granted, and I've recently learned that my form isn't great, and that there's a lot of things that can be improved. Now, that's not to say that I am going to consciously change my mechanics. Going back to sort of my last answer, it's more about correcting weaknesses and imbalances that exist. And once those are corrected, the idea is that then your stride will become a little bit more natural. Your form will improve as a result of curing some of these weaknesses and imbalances. So that's, again, why I think it's so important to implement this stuff as runners, both for injury prevention, but even more so for performance, because it really does, I think, make a big difference to ultimate, not only your longevity in the sport, but also how fast you can run. And, again, this has been sort of a newer emphasis for me. Like, I've always done a little bit of strength work, but I'm much more strategic now with the help of, people who are on my team that are professionals. Like, these aren't just routines that I came up with on my own. Like, I have good physical therapists and people that I'm working with to develop these plans. And I've noticed dramatic improvement already. So it's something I would definitely recommend listeners do.
Yeah. Like you said, not just for longevity, but for your efficiency of your running as well. It's, you know, you can see that's great. Okay, so we talked a little bit about your coach. So have you always had a coach, or is that something that you've, you know, come to sort of through your career, or, you know, did you self-train for a while? You know, how did that come about?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I came into the sport around 2009 or so. And at that point, you know, I didn't really have a lot of competitive ambitions. So I was just, you know, seeing what I could do, trying to finish, and, you know, naturally would improve just based on gaining experience as an athlete. I came into the sport with a general level of athleticism and fitness just because I'd always been an athlete. And then just gaining experience helped me to improve, you know, my performances in a very short period of time. Eventually, then, you know, after a few years of just sort of self-coaching, you sort of reach a plateau, for lack of a better word, where you're not seeing as big of improvement as, you know, you were in the early stages of my career. It was at that point when I reached out to Jason Koop, who has now been my coach for, I mean, I think we've been working together more than 6 years now. And so I had been in the sport for 3 or 4 years before we had gotten in touch. And as soon as we got together and he sort of took a look at the strategies I've been employing, which was not very sophisticated, by following his leadership, I was then able to get back on that trajectory of improvement that I was seeing in the earliest stages of my career. And it helped me just more than I could possibly communicate, like having a good coach and training specifically, and being strategic about how you periodize both your training and your rest and the intensity and where you train, all those considerations. That was new to me. And because I didn't have a running background, it was great to have his leadership and his guidance at that time when I was still young. As our relationship has progressed, I've learned so much from him that I feel like I've been able to take some of the work back from him a little bit. In other words, like I can sort of tailor the training. He can sort of give me a general framework of how the training is going to look, and then I can sort of tailor it more appropriately to how I feel internally. Where in the past, he would just write something down and I would do exactly that. Now I feel much more empowered to follow my own intuitions with training, but he's still, you know, my compass with regards to training strategy. And he's become a great friend and somebody I've learned a ton from, and who's helped me a lot in my career.
Oh, that's great. And I suppose, like you said, when you did make that decision to reach out to someone else and have someone sort of take that sort of responsibility for a little while, because it's some task, isn't it, building a training schedule for these, you know, these big races. It must feel. So if there were any of our audience that were kind of at that point where they were possibly thinking of reaching out to a coach, I mean, how did you decide that the time was right for you to do that, and that you needed to, you know, to reach out to Jason?
It was more because I had sort of felt that I was sort of at a crossroads in my career of like, okay, I'm either going to take this seriously or like I need to devote my time to something else. And because I had been an athlete my whole life, I had experience with lots of different coaches and from all different sports, right? So, and I've just always been somebody who's really responded well to coaching, who's valued my relationships and gotten along with my coaches throughout my life. And so I just knew, like, internally that it was something that would help me just based on past experiences as an athlete. This was, I mean, just 6 years ago, it was rare to even, you know, have ultra running coaches. You know, Jason was really one of the first real ultra specific coaches. And so it was not as if there was a lot of people who were getting help with their training at that time. So, for me, it was just like a feeling of like, okay, I think I do need help in this moment. And, who can I reach out to? And because there wasn't a lot of people, and I had known Jason just through racing, that he was like the first person that came to mind. And, like I said, he was able to, help me improve so much so quickly. And we've developed such a great relationship. And we, now have such a good sort of back and forth. Like things aren't rigid, we can tinker with things and adjust as we go based on how I'm feeling. That I've, like never felt the need to like, explore any other coaching opportunities. And, the question I get all the time that I think is, worth mentioning here is like, when people are really interested in like, how can I improve? I always say the number one thing you can do is hire a professional coach, even if it's just for 6 months or a year leading up to some goal that you have, or if it's something that then builds, over a multi-year relationship. No matter how short the relationship is or how long it lasts, if it's with a good coach, you will gain value out of it and you will improve. So finding the right person and committing to it and, sort of allowing them to take some of the work off your plate, as you said, is a really valuable thing as an athlete.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. So now moving specifically on to like the day of a race, are there any sort of specific actions, things that you do on race day to help you, execute your race, in the best way?
Actually, there's not. Like, I'm somebody who's not I'm not like superstitious. I, have a pretty simple, I think, program where I'm not somebody who gets up super early before races. You try and sleep as late as I can, wake up, have, a Red Bull and, piece of toast and go to the start line and, go for the day. I would say the only thing, that might be a little bit different is that I like to use both shoes and socks that are almost brand new for almost every race, so shoes that I've only run in maybe once or twice on short runs, and usually a brand new pair of socks. I find that just the comfort of those two things, even if it's just psychological, it helps me to feel good and comfortable. And of course, when you're going to be out there for, most of a day or longer, then I think those little things are helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because some people say, whatever you do, don't wear anything new on race day.
Yeah, I say always do something new on race day. Contrarian position.
Yeah, I'll be saying, well, Dylan Bowman told me that's what he does. Okay, so just thinking about longer races where there's night running involved, and running by a head torch can be quite a difficult skill to master. Have you got any sort of practical tips for the audience about, running in the dark?
Not really. I mean, I think it is something to be practiced if people are nervous about it. I think it's more just like being out alone in the mountains that I think is, difficult for people to think about, or, they might have a little bit of fear or trepidation going into a race that requires that. So if you can practice that a little bit in your training, of course, that's going to have value when it comes to race day. It's always been something that I love about the sport. Like, it's one of my favorite things is to just be out there totally alone with just my headlamp and the stuff in my pack in the mountains, just feeling totally free and self-sufficient. I think that's a really beautiful thing about the sport. And I think for people who do have fear about it, sort of changing the mindset in that way, I think might be helpful, of just understanding that it's actually a really cool thing that you can go out, be all on your own. And, for the most part, you are safe, even if it feels a little bit nerve-wracking to be alone in the dark in the mountains. As long as you have packed appropriately and you have good equipment, you're going to be safe. And I think oftentimes that change in mindset is more valuable than actually trying to practice with long training runs in the dark.
Yeah.
But using a good light is very important for sure.
Yeah. But like you say, that thing about going outside your comfort zone, it's surprising what you can learn about yourself, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, a bit sort of following on from that a little bit, thinking about the mental side of, ultra running. Have you got any particular sort of strategies and tips that you use to get you through, on race? That sort of mental barrier is often greater than the physical one, isn't it? Have you got any sort of tips you can share for how you can deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's all about changing your perspective, right? Like, it's actually a really amazing thing that we get to do what we do, and that our bodies are capable of doing what we ask of them. And for me, when I'm confronted with difficult feelings, or not having my best race, or even if I am having a good race but I'm not feeling particularly good at a certain moment, I often think about the people who support me, obviously, like my wife and my family. Oftentimes my wife travels to races with me and supports me, but if she's not there, like, I know she's watching on the internet, and so I'm always cognizant of, like, okay, like, if people are watching, I know my wife will be nervous if I'm not, at the aid station soon. And yeah, just sort of like thinking about, those people that love and support you, when you're out there, and knowing that whether you have a good race or a bad race, they're still going to be there for you. And I think it goes a long way to sort of like lift your spirits in tough moments. So I think a lot about my wife, my family, the people, like my sponsors, and the individual relationships I have with the people who support me, the brands that sponsor me. Those are all important things to lean on in tough times. So, but again, like, I think more so it's important to remember that we do it for fun, and we do it because it's not easy, and that's the gift of it, and we get to see ourselves through those situations and prove to ourselves that we can do it. So yeah, I think that change in mindset and perspective is the best thing to lean on in those tough moments.
It's almost like thinking to yourself, this is what I've come for, this is what I've trained for now, isn't it, when you get to that,
Yeah.
Okay, could you just give us a quick overview of your nutrition and your hydration during a race? So what do you like when you're racing?
Yeah, so again, I'm very simple. I'm not like very rigid in my program. I don't follow like I need X amount of calories per hour. I usually just kind of let it come to me. What I would say that has worked for me really well over the course of my career is that I mostly drink all my calories. So I use sort of high calorie drink mix. Oftentimes GU Roctane has been my go-to sort of nutritional strategy, or like what I get the bulk of my calories from. So it's like 250 calories per 500 ml soft flask. And, over the course of for example, at Mount Fuji last year, I probably had like between 20 and 25 bottles of Roctane. And that was pretty much all I had throughout the course of the whole race. Usually I will have a couple Red Bulls in the second half of a race. And especially like the longer the race goes, the more of those I'll have. Just like while I'm at an aid station reloading my bottles, I'll drink a can of Red Bull. And then, yeah, like if it strikes me, like again, going back to always try something new on race day, like pay attention to what you think you crave. So like I never have like soup or broth or whatever in my daily training, but I often will have broth at aid stations and races, or like sparkling water. Sometimes you just come in and you're like, oh, that would be so good, and I'll just chug some sparkling water at an aid station. So things like that. But I'm very simple. I drink almost all my calories, and then we'll occasionally snack on like fruits or potatoes or Red Bulls or sparkling waters. That's pretty much it.
I love that question. I love hearing what people say for that, because it's so individual, isn't it? Okay. I'm coming towards the end there, but are there any really key bits of gear that you really rate, that that you couldn't be without? Any particular things that you really rate and are essential for you?
Well, I think in our sport now, like aside from your footwear, the most important piece of equipment is your pack. For most all the big races now, particularly the long ones, you have to have a good pack, to carry all the mandatory equipment and your nutrition and fluids and things like that. So, I think the most important piece of equipment for me is the North Face Flight Series trail vest, which I actually helped to design with the North Face, last year. And to me, it's just like super comfortable, something that is dependable and functional. Like it has all the right pockets in the right places, and able to integrate your poles with it too, which are also really important pieces of equipment for these long distance mountain races. So that would be my key sort of go-to piece of equipment if I had to choose, is that flight trail vest.
Lovely. Okay, so before we start to wrap it up, I just want to ask you a couple more questions. The first one is going to be, what, in your opinion, are 3 characteristics that can help you to be successful in ultra running?
Enthusiasm, stubbornness, and a healthy bit of impatience.
I like that. I didn't, and you didn't say total leave of your senses.
Sometimes it requires what could be negative personality traits in other contexts to push yourself through, such as stubbornness. So, I think those would be good.
Yeah, good. And if you could give your younger self one piece of advice, when you were just sort of finishing up with the lacrosse and just starting out on your running journey, now with everything you've learned over this this 10 years that you've been running, with what would you probably wouldn't have listened at 24, but if you could give yourself one piece of advice, what would it have been?
Well, I would sort of reiterate a few things that we've said already. One, get a coach, get that help earlier in my career. Even though I think it was a good progression for me to have a couple years where I learned on my own. I think that's something I would have told myself earlier. Again, the strength training and physical therapy and injury prevention stuff that we've talked about at length, and just like to not be so like hard on myself sometimes. Like I think, again, we do it because we love it and because it's just like such an amazing sport, such a great community, and it just offers so many amazing experiences. But sometimes, we can get a little bit too caught up in like how our performances are as it compares to other people and those sorts of things. And, particularly on the professional end, I think is more tempting to be more critical of yourself in that regard. And so that's something that I've really learned this year, is that like, I need to just be a little bit better to myself and not, not be so hard and so critical, and like give myself time to heal when my body clearly needs it, rather than trying to push through everything, because that's sort of always been my default as an athlete, as an ultra runner, is to push through everything. Right. And sometimes you do need to just take care of yourself and not push through things. And you have to learn that the hard way sometimes, which I have. So that would be my advice.
Yeah. I think it's a characteristic of youth, isn't it? That when we're younger, we don't stop and take in the view, do we? We just, when you're focused on what you're doing and head down, in life as well as in running, you don't take that time to stop and think, look how lucky I am, look how fortunate I am to be able to be doing this. And, Yeah. Okay, if there's anybody watching who is possibly just thinking about starting on an ultra running journey, so perhaps they're already a runner but they're running shorter distances, or perhaps they're new completely, what would be a piece of advice that you would give to anybody that's toying with the idea of entering an ultra?
I would say to commit to it, because going back to my personality traits, I think enthusiasm was what helped me to be successful early in my career. I was just obsessed with it, like I just wanted to be doing it. And I knew at my first 100-miler at the Leadville 100, I'd only been running for like a year at that point, and I just knew, like, I just wanted to be there so bad, and I knew that there was just nothing that was going to stop me from finishing that day. Like, no matter what happened, I knew it was going to be hard, but I couldn't wait for it. And I was able to have a good race in my first 100-miler, and I think it was because I had that attitude. And I think that enthusiasm is so valuable in our sport, just because you need to want to do it. It's hard enough to where if you give yourself any excuses, you're not going to enjoy it. Like, even if you finish it, you're not going to really enjoy it. So committing to it and doing everything you can to actually like want to do it and be excited for it, it just goes a long way, I think.
Yeah, I can imagine. And finally, I mean, you've kind of already answered this really, but I was going to ask you if we've got people that are watching who are, perhaps fairly established ultra runners, but they're keen to sort of take it to the next level and to progress. I mean, I think your advice about taking a coach would fall into this question, but is there anything else that you might say to them?
I would say invest in yourself. I think people are just sort of like waiting for sponsors to come and, pay for their trips and pay for, pay for their travel and, pay them in general. And oftentimes, you really have to invest in yourself before that stuff comes along. And I mean, not only to like pay for if you feel like, okay, I want to have a great performance at this particular race, but it's going to require me to travel, take that financial hit, buy that plane ticket, and go with that feeling of enthusiasm and confidence in yourself. Invest in that potential opportunity to help launch you into the next step of your career, instead of like waiting for somebody to come and present an opportunity for you. Invest in yourself, if it's financially or otherwise, and give yourself that opportunity. Same goes for your health. Spend money and time on your health, whether it's massage or physical therapy, chiropractors. Those are things that we can't take for granted and that we can't get back at a certain point if we neglect them. So invest in yourself, I would say, is the most important thing for people who are trying to take that next step.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And like you say, you would invest in a business that you expected to pay dividends. So if you want your body to pay dividends, you need to be prepared to make some investment in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that about brings us to the end. Thank you ever so much, Dylan. It was really, really interesting. We're really grateful for you giving up your time to talk to us.
Yeah. Thanks.
What we'll do is we'll put all the links so you can go and follow Dylan online and check his journey and see how 2020 unfolds. We wish you all the best, Dylan, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura. Have a good one.
And you. Thanks, Dylan. That was really good.
Thanks a lot.
I hope you have a Merry Christmas.
Yeah, you as well. Take care.
Take care and best of luck for next year.
Appreciate that.